Let me be clear, I don't like you people. Officer Travis Mitchell didn't hesitate when he said it. To him, Danielle Carter was nothing more than another black woman who would back down, another name he could throw into the system without consequence. He humiliated her in front of her daughter, escalated the situation until he had her in cuffs, and paraded her out of the diner like a criminal. He believed there would be no consequences, that this was just another routine display of unchecked power, another morning where his badge made him untouchable. But Danielle Carter wasn't just any woman. She was the wife of Marcus Carter, the new chief of police, the man Mitchell would soon answer to. Watch as it all unfolds. You won't believe what happens next. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. At a booth near the window, Danielle Carter sat across from her 8-year-old daughter, Mia, the morning light casting a soft glow against the girl's small face as she twirled a piece of pancake on her fork. The young girl's braids bounced slightly as she tilted her head, watching her mother with the sharp attentiveness that only children possessed, her curiosity laced with excitement. "Mommy, when's Daddy coming home?" she asked, her voice light but filled with expectation. Danielle, who had just taken a sip of her coffee, smiled as she set the cup down, her fingers curling lightly around the rim. "Daddy's got a big day today. Remember? He starts his new job." There was a quiet pride in her voice, subtle but unmistakable, something that had settled in her chest ever since Marcus had received the call. Mia's eyes widened slightly as she straightened in her seat, clearly remembering the conversation. "His promotion?" she asked, her small hands pressing against the edge of the table as if the thought alone was something to hold on to. Danielle nodded, reaching for the syrup and drizzling just a little more onto her plate before glancing up at her daughter. "That's right. He's the boss now." Her lips curved into a small, knowing smile, the words carrying the weight of something deeper, something Mia might not yet fully understand. Mia giggled, her spoon clinking lightly against her plate as she kicked her feet beneath the table, a habit she had yet to grow out of. "Does that mean he gets to tell everybody what to do?" Danielle chuckled softly, shaking her head. "It means he has a lot of responsibility," she corrected, her tone gentle but firm. "He'll be busier. But that doesn't change anything at home. He's still Daddy." Mia seemed to consider this, her brows knitting together slightly in thought before she broke into a smile. "I bet he's gonna be the best boss ever." Danielle's smile deepened, her gaze softening as she reached over to tuck a stray braid behind Mia's ear. "I think so too, baby." The diner door swung open with a sharp chime, and Officer Travis Mitchell stepped inside. His presence carried a different kind of weight than the easy warmth that filled the space before. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but it was felt. The conversation at one of the nearby tables faltered slightly before resuming at a more subdued level, the sound of silverware clinking against plates suddenly standing out just a little more. Danielle didn't turn her head, but she knew. She felt the shift, the momentary discomfort that his presence always brought. And then, just as expected, his eyes found her table. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, but it wasn't friendly. It was something else, something calculating. A glance that wasn't just an acknowledgement, but a decision. The kind of look that people like him gave people like her. Measuring, dismissive, already holding an opinion before a single word was exchanged. His lips barely moved, but there was a tightening around his jaw, the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, as if something about seeing her there bothered him. Danielle didn't react, didn't shift or stiffen, didn't give him the satisfaction of so much as a glance in return. Instead, she picked up her coffee again, her expression calm, her posture steady. Mia, blissfully unaware of the silent exchange, was still focused on their conversation. "Do you think Daddy's nervous?" she asked, her voice bright, the question slipping in seamlessly, undisturbed by the undercurrent that had just entered the room. Danielle exhaled slowly, stirring her coffee with the tip of her spoon, before offering her daughter a small, reassuring smile. "Maybe a little," she admitted, picturing her husband adjusting his tie in the mirror that morning, rolling his shoulders, taking a breath before stepping into his new office for the first time. But he's worked hard for this, and he's ready. Mia nodded, seemingly satisfied with that answer, and went back to eating, completely unaware that, across the room, Mitchell hadn't looked away. He was still watching them, still deciding. And Danielle, keeping her focus on her daughter, keeping the moment intact for Mia's sake, already knew. He was going to say something. And when he did, she wasn't going to let it slide. She glanced up briefly, eyes catching the reflection of movement in the diner's large front window, the blur of a familiar uniform cutting through the morning scene. She didn't have to turn to know Mitchell was still there, lingering just a little longer than necessary. His presence a quiet but deliberate weight, pressing at the edges of the moment. She refused to give him anything. Instead, she turned her attention fully back to Mia, who had just succeeded in cutting her pancake into neat little squares, her face lighting up with pride as she speared one with her fork. Danielle smiled. "Look at you. You're getting good at that." Mia grinned, her feet kicking lightly beneath the table as she reached for her juice with her free hand, her excitement still bubbling from their earlier conversation. "I bet Daddy isn't nervous at all," she said between bites, her voice brimming with confidence. "I bet he's already telling everyone what to do." Danielle chuckled, shaking her head. "I think he's still just getting settled in," she corrected, lifting her cup again. "He's got a lot to learn, but he's ready for it." Mia nodded as if that made perfect sense, and as she reached for the napkin beside her plate, her elbow caught the edge of her juice glass, knocking it sideways. It all happened quickly, too quickly to stop. The glass wobbled, the juice sloshing dangerously toward the table's edge, and in her rush to correct it, Mia jerked forward, her small shoulder bumping squarely into Mitchell just as he passed by. The officer's coffee spilled instantly, the dark liquid splashing onto his uniform, the heat of it undoubtedly seeping through the fabric. For a fraction of a second, everything stilled. The diner, though still filled with murmured conversation, seemed to pause in a way that wasn't quite visible but could be felt. The sound of silverware didn't stop, but the glances, the awareness, were there, rippling quietly beneath the surface. Mia's eyes went wide, her expression frozen between shock and immediate regret as she looked up at the officer, her mouth opening slightly, words struggling to form. Danielle was already moving, reaching instinctively for a napkin, her tone calm but firm as she turned to Mia. "It's okay, baby. It was an accident." Mitchell, however, wasn't looking at the mess. His eyes were fixed on Mia, his jaw set, his shoulders squared with that unmistakable posture of authority that had no business being directed at a child. His face twisted, not in visible anger, but in something close to it, something uglier in its restraint, something that held back just enough to stay on the side of acceptable but still carried an edge designed to make itself known. Danielle saw it immediately. Mia, still standing there, napkin clutched in her small hands, looked up at him with wide, uncertain eyes. And then Mitchell's lips curled ever so slightly. "Well," he drawled, brushing off his sleeve far too slowly, making a deliberate show of it, his voice carrying that practiced ease of someone who had long since perfected the art of condescension. "Guess I should have known better than to walk past a table like this." Danielle's fingers tightened subtly around the napkin, her expression remaining calm, controlled, even as something colder settled in her chest. She exhaled carefully, keeping her voice smooth as she focused on Mia first. "Go ahead and sit down, sweetheart. It's just coffee. It's not a big deal." Mia hesitated, still gripping the napkin like she wasn't sure what to do with it, her gaze flicking between her mother and the officer. Danielle, never breaking eye contact with Mitchell, nodded reassuringly at her daughter. Mia sat down. Only then did Danielle turn fully toward Mitchell, her posture poised, her tone polite but firm, carrying just enough weight to make it clear she wasn't going to let this go unanswered. "She's a kid," she said simply, her voice even, not a hint of apology in it. "It was an accident." Mitchell made a quiet sound, something that wasn't quite a laugh but carried the same dismissive tone, something that said he wasn't really interested in what she had to say. He reached for the napkin from his belt, dabbing at the front of his uniform with exaggerated movements before flicking a glance down at Mia. "Sure," he said, "but I guess when nobody teaches them to behave, accidents happen." Danielle felt it before she even processed it. The shift, the meaning, the weight behind the words that had nothing to do with spilled coffee. The diner was quieter now. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't the kind of silence that people acknowledged, but it was there, lurking beneath the surface, a tension that settled into the space like a storm gathering on the horizon. Danielle's breath came slow and steady, her fingers resting lightly on the tabletop, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm sorry. What was that?" she asked, her voice still smooth, still calm, but now carrying an edge of its own. Mitchell's lips twitched again, his head tilting just slightly. He liked this part. The push, the moment where he got to see how far he could go, how much he could get away with, how deep he could dig before the line snapped. He let out a small, mocking chuckle, shaking his head as he finally met her gaze, head on. "Relax," he said, his tone shifting just enough to sound casual, like the words didn't carry a deeper meaning. "I was just saying, sometimes these things happen when there's no—" And then he hesitated. He waited, just a second, just long enough to let her feel it. Then, farther around, the words landed like a strike. Intentional, calculated, not loud, not harsh, but designed to cut. And just like that, the moment shifted entirely. The quiet wait in the diner deepened, something stretching taut in the air as Danielle sat there, absorbing what had just been said, the implication ringing louder than if he had shouted it. Mia didn't fully understand, but she felt it. Danielle knew because her daughter's small fingers curled against the edge of the table, her movement hesitant, uncertain. Danielle inhaled slowly, deeply, her body language carefully controlled, measured. Mitchell, watching her now, waiting, knew exactly what he had done. And Danielle knew exactly what she was going to do next, because this wasn't going to slide. "You know, I was really hoping I misheard you just now," she said, her tone light on the surface, but edged with something unmistakable. "Because you're not actually standing in the middle of a diner, talking to a child's mother, implying something you have absolutely no business commenting on." Mitchell's smirk widened, just a little, just enough to be noticed. He straightened slightly, shifting his stance, rolling his shoulders like someone getting comfortable, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He was testing the boundaries, prodding for a reaction, seeing just how far he could take it. "Oh, come on," he said, lifting his hands in an exaggerated, mocking display of innocence. "I was just making an observation. No need to get worked up." Danielle exhaled sharply through her nose, the muscles in her jaw tightening just slightly, as she forced herself to keep the calm exterior intact. The way he said it, the way he made it sound like she was overreacting, like she was creating the problem instead of responding to it, the way his type always did this, baiting, twisting, pushing just far enough so that when someone pushed back, suddenly, they were the issue. "You weren't making an observation," she said, her tone dropping just a little, just enough to let him feel it now. "You were making an assumption, and not just about me." She shifted slightly, keeping her voice level, keeping the quiet power of it intact as she leaned in just enough. "You were making an assumption about my daughter, a child, and you did it because you thought you could, because you thought it would go unchecked." A flicker of something crossed Mitchell's expression. Brief, barely there, but Danielle caught it. A moment of irritation, of realization that she wasn't going to step back, wasn't going to take this quietly. And for the first time, the power between them shifted. The diner was quiet enough now that the tension was no longer just understood, it was fully present. The few people nearby who had been trying to stay out of it were now caught in it, trapped in the moment, whether they wanted to be or not. No one looked directly at them, but no one left either. Mitchell, sensing that the moment was slipping from him, adjusted his stance, his fingers flexing against his belt, brushing against the edge of his holster, not in any real motion to use it, but in a way that was meant to be seen. A reminder. Danielle's eyes flicked down to the movement, then back up, unimpressed. Mia, still watching, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands gripping her napkin tightly now. Danielle saw it out of the corner of her eye. The small way her daughter had tensed, the way her breathing had become just a little more careful. And that wasn't going to happen. Danielle turned back to Mitchell, her expression even sharper now, quieter but stronger. "You know what's funny?" she said, tilting her head slightly. "I was just telling my daughter about her father this morning, about how he's stepping into a new role, about how he's worked hard to get to where he is." She let the words hang, deliberate, knowing that Mitchell didn't know yet, knowing that, right now, his ignorance was the only thing keeping him smug. She watched as he barely held back an eye roll, shifting his weight as if he were already dismissing the conversation, as if he had already decided he was done here. "Sure," he muttered, his voice lower now, but still carrying that same bored condescension. Danielle let out a slow, thoughtful hum. "You know, it's interesting," she continued, ignoring the way he tried to wave her off. "Because the way you said that just now, that little remark about a father not being around, that's not an accident, Officer Mitchell." Mitchell's mouth twitched. Danielle didn't stop. "Because the way I see it, you walk into this diner, you see me sitting here with my daughter, and you made a choice." She tilted her head slightly, narrowing her gaze just enough to make sure he knew she saw exactly what he was doing. "You didn't have to say anything. You didn't have to assume anything, but you did, because you thought it would go unchecked." Mitchell's smirk had faded just slightly now. His expression remained composed, but something in his posture had changed. The confidence was still there, but now there was something else underneath, a flicker of irritation, of frustration. He didn't like being called out, didn't like that she wasn't letting it go, and Danielle saw it. She saw it, and she made sure he knew it. Mia, still watching, seemed unsure, glancing between them, sensing the energy shifting in a way she couldn't quite name. And Mitchell? Mitchell, now fully aware that he wasn't the one in control of the conversation anymore, exhaled sharply through his nose, letting out a low, forced chuckle. "Well," he said, straightening again, adjusting his belt with a sharp, unnecessary tug, "seems like someone's a little sensitive this morning." Danielle smiled then, not out of amusement, not because she was backing down, but because she had already decided she wasn't finished. "Oh no, officer," she said, her voice softer now, but heavier. "I'm just making an observation." Mitchell's jaw ticked. The diner was silent now, and Danielle, meeting his eyes, unflinching, unshaken, already knew he was going to push this further. "You know," he started, voice carrying the practiced ease of someone used to being listened to, "this right here, this attitude, this is why y'all always have problems with the law." Danielle heard the shift in Mia's breathing before anything else. A sharp, small inhale, a child's first instinctive understanding that something was wrong. She felt something coil tightly in her chest, something too familiar, too expected. There it was, right there. The moment, the slip, the mask falling just enough for her to see the truth beneath it. Mitchell's words didn't come out angry. They weren't shouted, weren't delivered with open malice. No, he said them smoothly, easily, like it was a fact, like it was something so deeply ingrained in his worldview that it barely needed emphasis. And that was worse. Danielle inhaled slowly through her nose, exhaled just as evenly. She didn't react. Not in the way he wanted, not in the way he was baiting her to. Instead, she studied him now, fully, clearly, like she was seeing exactly what he was. "Oh?" she murmured, tilting her head slightly. "And what exactly do you mean by y'all?" Mitchell's smirk widened, pleased with himself now. "Oh, you know," he said lightly, deliberately, relishing the moment. "The ones who always seem to think they don't have to follow the rules. The ones who love to play victim when the consequences come knocking." Danielle felt Mia shift beside her, her daughter's small hands gripping her napkin tightly enough now that the edges were starting to wrinkle. Danielle knew that later she would have to sit her down, hold her close, tell her that this wasn't her fault, that this wasn't something she had to carry, that the world wasn't supposed to be this way, even though it was. But right now, she had to handle this. She leaned forward slightly, resting her forearms against the table, controlled, poised. "You know," she said smoothly, her voice carrying something quieter now, something deliberate. "I was actually planning on just finishing my breakfast, having a nice morning with my daughter. But you walked in here, saw me sitting here, and decided that wasn't going to happen. So now I'm curious." She lifted her chin just slightly, gaze locked onto his. "What exactly is your problem?" Mitchell's smirk faltered. It was slight, quick, barely noticeable, but Danielle saw it. He wasn't expecting her to meet him here, wasn't expecting her to remain composed, wasn't expecting her to be the one in control of this moment. His fingers flexed against his belt again, his stance adjusting, the weight of authority slipping back into his posture now. "My problem?" he repeated, his voice carrying an edge now. "Lady, I don't have a problem. You do." He let the words hang, shifting slightly so that his badge caught the light just enough. Danielle felt the moment twist, felt the shift from condescension to something heavier, something laced with a warning. Mia, sensing the change, leaned closer to her mother, her small frame pressing subtly against Danielle's side, seeking the unspoken reassurance of contact. Danielle's fingers, still resting on the table, curled slightly. And then Mitchell gave a mocking chuckle, shaking his head, as if this was nothing more than an inconvenience, an annoyance in his day. "See, this is exactly what I mean. You people love to make a scene, love to act like you're the victim the second someone calls you out. And then, when things don't go your way, you cry about it. Same old story." Danielle heard it. The slight inhale from the diner owner behind the counter, the way someone at a nearby booth shifted uncomfortably. But still, no one said anything. No one ever did. She let out a slow, measured breath, refusing to let the anger settle too deep, refusing to let it take root where it would cloud her judgment. Because he wanted that. That's what he was waiting for. She saw the way his fingers lingered near his belt, near his radio, ready for her to give him a reason. And then, before she could respond, before she could decide whether to deconstruct him with words, or simply let him sit in the weight of his own hatred, he did exactly what she expected. He smiled, bright, arrogant, triumphant. And then he said, casual as anything, "Then again, I guess I shouldn't be surprised. No father around, no real discipline. No wonder the kid's already a problem." Danielle felt something cold settle into her chest. Beside her, Mia, her sweet, brilliant, too observant for her age daughter, went still. For a fraction of a second, the diner was nothing but silence. Then Danielle stood up. The movement was smooth, slow, deliberate. She didn't rush, didn't slam her chair back, didn't react with the heat he was expecting. She refused to give him that. Instead, she placed both hands on the table, leaning forward just slightly, her expression calm but unwavering, her presence unshakable. "That," she said, her voice steady, cool, measured, the kind of controlled tone that carried more power than a shout ever could, "was the last thing you're going to say about my child." Mitchell's smirk didn't waver, but his body betrayed him. A shift, small, barely there, but she caught it. "Or what?" he drawled, tilting his head, pushing, still pushing, always pushing. "You gonna throw a tantrum? 'Cause a disturbance? Make me do my job?" Danielle's lips curled, not in a smile, but in something close, something sharp, something that told him she wasn't afraid of him. "No," she said smoothly, watching the way his fingers twitched slightly. "You're going to do that all on your own." Mitchell's jaw ticked. A pause, a beat, and then, exactly as she knew he would, He went for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying a false calm, the kind of practiced tone that sounded professional enough over the radio, but was designed to do one thing: control the narrative before anyone else could. "I've got a disorderly individual at Mel's Diner. Female, black, mid-30s, refusing to comply with law enforcement directives. Possible escalation in progress." Danielle let out a slow, steady breath, forcing herself to keep her posture composed, her hands still on the table. He wanted a reaction. He wanted fear. He wanted submission. She wasn't giving him any of it. "Escalation," she repeated, tilting her head slightly, her voice carrying the same sharp control she had maintained since the beginning of this conversation. "Escalation would imply there was a threat, officer. I think we both know the only person trying to escalate anything here is you." Mitchell's jaw twitched, just slightly. But she saw it. He wasn't used to being challenged so directly. He exhaled sharply through his nose, his smirk returning, but now it was thinner, tighter, less certain. "Oh, I see what you're trying to do," he said, shifting his stance slightly, placing himself closer now, as if he was trying to make himself bigger, more imposing. "You think if you keep your voice nice and calm, if you act like you're in control, people will believe you. But I got news for you, lady. I'm the one with the badge here. I'm the one who decides how this situation ends." Danielle's lips curled into a small, humorless smile. "You think that badge makes you untouchable," she said, her voice softer now, sharper, watching the way his expression darkened slightly, how the first hints of frustration flickered behind his eyes. "That's the problem, isn't it? You think that uniform gives you the right to do whatever you want. Say whatever you want. Treat people however you want." Mitchell snorted, shaking his head. "Spare me the lecture, sweetheart. I know exactly how this goes. You're gonna stand there, act all righteous, pretend like you didn't bring this on yourself, then when you're cuffed and in the back of my car, you'll start crying about how it's unfair." Danielle let out a quiet breath through her nose. She had heard it all before. He was baiting her. He wanted her to break, wanted her to snap, wanted her to give him the excuse. Instead, she straightened, her expression unreadable. "And when exactly did I break the law, officer?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "Was it when I ordered breakfast? When I sat at my own table? When I refused to let you insult me in front of my child?" Mitchell's smirk hardened. He was done pretending now. "When you refused to follow orders," he snapped, his voice turning sharp now, carrying an edge that was no longer disguised. "You're disturbing the peace, and I don't have to explain myself to you." Danielle felt Mia's small fingers brush against her sleeve, hesitant, uncertain. Her daughter didn't speak, but the touch was enough. Enough to remind her who was watching. Enough to remind her that this wasn't just about her. Enough to remind her that she needed to handle this carefully, no matter how much she wanted to let the full force of her anger show. She turned her head slightly, just enough to catch Mia's wide, nervous eyes. "Sweetheart, listen to me," she said, keeping her voice steady, keeping the moment from collapsing under the weight of fear. "It's okay. I need you to be brave, okay?" Mitchell rolled his eyes, scoffing. "Oh, give me a break." A movement from the corner of the diner cut him off. Danielle saw it just as one of the waitresses, Lisa, a woman who had worked here for years, someone Danielle had known in passing, someone who had never been more than polite, was already stepping forward. Lisa's expression was tight, her movements brisk, but there was something in her eyes, something unspoken, something that carried weight. "I'll take her," Lisa said, her voice quick but firm. She reached a hand toward Mia, gesturing for her. "Come on, sweetheart. Why don't you come with me? You can wait in the back." Danielle's heart tightened, but she forced herself to nod. Mia didn't need to see this. Mia hesitated, her small fingers gripping the fabric of her mother's sleeve just slightly, her breath coming just a little faster. Danielle gave her hand a squeeze. "It's okay, baby," she said, soft, steady, reassuring. "Go with Miss Lisa." Mia looked up at her again, searching for something For certainty. For safety. Danielle gave her a small nod. And after a moment, Mia slowly, hesitantly let go. Lisa took her hand, and as she led her away, Mia cast one more glance over her shoulder. Her face too young to carry this much worry, Danielle kept her expression composed, even as something in her chest ached at the sight. Then, just as Lisa disappeared with Mia into the back of the diner, Mitchell moved. His hand closed around her wrist, sharp, sudden, authoritative. Danielle snapped her gaze back to him. The touch was firm, deliberate, an unspoken declaration. "You just made this a whole lot harder on yourself," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of the authority he thought protected him. And just like that, the moment tipped over the edge. Danielle barely had time to brace herself before he twisted her wrist, before the cuffs came out, before the weight of his control came crashing down. The sharp click of the cuffs locking around Danielle's wrists sent a ripple through the diner. Not a loud one, not a gasp, or a cry, or any kind of verbal protest, but a shift, an unspoken acknowledgement that something had just happened that could not be undone. The weight of cold steel against her skin was familiar in a way that it never should have been. She had seen it before, on the news, in stories told in hushed voices, in viral videos where voices shouted about rights, even as hands were forced behind backs. But now it was her wrists bound together, and now her daughter was in the back of the diner, scared, listening, unable to see what was happening, but knowing. Mitchell's grip was firm, his fingers digging into her arm just slightly, enough to be felt, but not enough to bruise. Yet, he was careful in the way that men like him always were, rough in ways that didn't leave evidence, forceful in ways that couldn't be disputed later. Danielle kept her breathing steady, her expression composed, her posture unbowed, because he wanted her to struggle. He wanted her to fight back, to thrash, to give him an excuse. And she refused. "Look at that," Mitchell said, his voice carrying a mocking satisfaction, tilting his head slightly as he tugged her forward, forcing her to take the first step toward the door. "Just like I said, every single time it ends the same way. You people just don't know how to act right, do you?" Danielle inhaled slowly, carefully, letting the words settle in her chest, letting them sit there like burning coals, but refusing to let them ignite. "I think we both know exactly what you are," she said, her voice steady, even, razor-sharp, "and I think you're afraid to say it out loud." Mitchell's jaw tensed, his smirk faltering just slightly, and that was enough. Enough for her to know that she had gotten to him. Enough for her to know that, no matter how tight his grip was, he wasn't the one in control. He yanked her arm harder than necessary, pulling her toward the exit, knowing everyone was watching, but also knowing that no one was going to stop him. The silence in the diner was thick, oppressive, but it wasn't new. This was the kind of silence that had existed for generations, the kind of silence that allowed things like this to keep happening, the kind that pressed against the walls of places like this and sat at tables like an unseen guest. Danielle saw the faces as she was led past them, the ones who avoided eye contact, the ones who glanced down at their plates as if they could pretend this wasn't happening, the ones who had watched from the beginning but had not spoken up. The diner owner, standing behind the counter, his lips pressed into a thin line, his hands gripping the rag he had been using to wipe down the counter just a little too tightly. The older couple in the booth by the window, shifting uncomfortably, the woman's hand hovering over her husband's wrist, as if contemplating whether to reach for it, whether to say something. And then there was Lisa, standing just outside the doorway that led to the back of the diner, where Mia had disappeared only moments before. Her expression was tense, her fingers still resting lightly on the edge of the doorframe, her body positioned in a way that told Danielle she was listening for any sign of distress from the little girl now hidden away. Danielle didn't say anything, but their eyes met for a brief moment, long enough for something unspoken to pass between them. Mia was safe, for now. Then the door swung open, and the world outside greeted them with blinding morning light and the cold, indifferent presence of the squad car waiting at the curb. Mitchell pulled her forward, past the few pedestrians who had stopped to watch, past the woman walking her dog who hesitated mid-step, past the man at the newspaper stand who quickly turned away. And then, just as they reached the car, just as he moved to open the back door, he leaned in closer, lowering his voice so that no one else would hear, but making sure she felt the heat of his breath against her ear. "You'll be out in a few hours, but don't worry," he murmured, his voice carrying that same faux politeness, that same quiet, smug satisfaction. "I'm sure your kind is used to spending a little time in holding." Danielle's fingers curled into her palms, her nails pressing into her skin, her breathing even, controlled. He wanted her to react. He wanted her to break. Instead, she let a slow, deliberate smile curl at the edge of her lips, turning her head just slightly, just enough to meet his eyes. "Oh, don't worry," she said, her voice smooth as silk, carrying something dangerous beneath the surface. "You'll see me again soon." For the briefest second, there was something there, something flickering in his expression, something uncertain, something that recognized, for just a moment, that maybe he had miscalculated. And then he shoved her into the back seat, and the door slammed shut. The inside of the patrol car smelled like sweat and worn-out authority, like leather that had absorbed too many hours of tension, too many arrests, too many stories that no one would ever bother to tell. The air was thick, unmoving, heavy with the silence that stretched between Danielle and the partition that separated her from Mitchell, who sat in the front seat, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel, like this was just another routine, just another morning, just another black woman he had put in cuffs for daring to stand her ground. Danielle sat perfectly still, her shoulders back, her wrists aching from the unnecessarily tight metal cutting into her skin. But her face remained composed, unreadable. He wanted to see fear. He wanted to see regret. He wanted her to shrink in the back seat, to break under the weight of what had just happened. But she gave him nothing. Instead, she shifted slightly, rolling her wrists just enough to test the movement, then exhaled a slow, measured breath. "You always this eager to waste taxpayer dollars, officer?" Mitchell smirked without looking back, tilting his head slightly. "See, that's what I love about your kind," he said, his voice carrying that casual cruelty, that ease of dismissal. "Always got something to say. Always playing the victim the second things don't go your way. You run your mouth. You get the consequences. Simple as that." Danielle let out a quiet hum, tilting her head against the headrest, watching the buildings blur past the window as they drove through town. "I think it's funny," she mused, voice steady, sharp, "how people like you always say you're kind, but never have the spine to say what you really mean. Guess that badge doesn't give you as much courage as you like to pretend." Mitchell's grip on the wheel tightened for half a second, a fraction of hesitation, a twitch in his jaw. He let out a sharp chuckle, shaking his head as he pulled the car into the police station lot. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" he muttered, throwing the car into park before finally turning his head to glance back at her. His smirk was still there, but there was something else now, something tense beneath it. "Doesn't really matter. You'll have plenty of time to sit in holding and think about it." Danielle met his eyes through the cage of the partition, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him feel it. Then she smiled, slow, deliberate, steady. "You really don't know what's coming, do you?" she murmured. Mitchell's smirk twitched slightly, but before he could respond, he pushed open his door, slamming it behind him as he rounded the car. The back door swung open, his grip closing around her arm again. Firm, unnecessary, a reminder. Danielle let herself be pulled forward, let her heels click sharply against the pavement, let the weight of the cuffs dig into her skin with every step. But in her mind, she was already ahead of him, because she knew something he didn't. She knew that everything was about to change. The air inside the precinct carried a familiar, practiced efficiency. Officers moved through the space with the kind of ease that came from knowing their routine, knowing their rank, knowing their place. Desks were cluttered with paperwork. Phones rang intermittently, and the low murmur of conversation filled the space as a new presence settled into the atmosphere. Chief Marcus Carter had arrived. He stood near the entrance of his new office, his tall, commanding frame dressed in a crisp, dark uniform, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His posture was relaxed but firm, his expression neutral but observant, taking in the movement around him, the shifting energy of the room. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to raise his voice to make an impression. His presence was enough. A few officers glanced in his direction, some openly watching, some pretending to stay focused on their tasks, but still sneaking careful glances, trying to gauge him, measure him, figure out what kind of leader he would be. He had been introduced to a few already, most polite, some cautious, a few clearly uncertain. He had expected that. He had walked into precincts before where the weight of his presence alone had been enough to shift the air. This was no different. He had just finished exchanging words with his second-in-command, Captain Reynolds, an older officer with a lined face and a gaze that carried more curiosity than hostility, when the front doors of the station swung open. Marcus turned instinctively, his posture still easy, his mind still half-focused on the conversation. And then he saw her, Danielle, handcuffed, led by an officer who hadn't even noticed him yet. Marcus felt the world tilt, snap, recalibrate all at once. For a moment, he was frozen, not out of uncertainty, not out of hesitation, but out of the sheer, unreal weight of the moment. And then, before his brain had even caught up to his body, he was already moving. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the air like steel. "What the hell is this?" Mitchell stopped abruptly, caught off guard by the sudden presence of authority he hadn't been expecting. He turned, still smug, still full of himself, still believing he had every bit of control, until he saw Marcus, until his eyes flickered to the nameplate on the uniform, until the realization crashed into him like a brick wall. Marcus Carter. Chief. Marcus's expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, locked onto Mitchell with an intensity that could crack stone. Mitchell opened his mouth, scrambling for words, scrambling for an explanation, scrambling to make sense of something he was only now beginning to understand. Danielle, still standing there, still composed despite the cuffs, tilted her head slightly, watching the moment unfold. She took a slow, measured breath. Then, with the same unwavering calm she had carried all morning, she turned her head toward her husband. "Marcus," she said, voice smooth, steady, dripping with quiet, lethal satisfaction. "I'd like to introduce you to the officer who arrested me this morning." Marcus didn't blink, didn't breathe, didn't move. And then, after a long, weighted pause, he exhaled, low, controlled, dangerous. His eyes, still locked onto Mitchell, narrowed ever so slightly. And in that moment, Mitchell knew he was done. The air in the precinct had shifted. It wasn't something loud, wasn't something obvious, but it was felt. A sudden, tangible shift in weight, a tension that settled over the space like the static charge before a storm. Mitchell stood frozen, his fingers tightening slightly around the cuffs still locked around Danielle's wrists. His entire body caught between reflex and realization, between the moment before he knew and the moment after he understood. Marcus hadn't moved. He stood in place, his gaze locked onto Mitchell, his expression composed, but the silence between them was more suffocating than any outburst could have been. Mitchell's mouth opened slightly, his mind clearly scrambling, struggling to bridge the impossible gap between what he thought had happened and what was actually unfolding in front of him. And then, finally, his voice cracked through the silence, forced and uncertain in a way that was completely at odds with the arrogant confidence he had carried just moments before. "Chief," he started, shifting his stance, his voice still trying to grasp for the authority he had just realized was slipping through his fingers. Marcus didn't react. He didn't blink, didn't move, didn't acknowledge the weak attempt at control. Instead, his gaze flickered downward, just briefly, to the cuffs on his wife's wrists. Danielle stood still, poised, her chin lifted just slightly, her expression unreadable but carrying the kind of silence that spoke volumes. She could feel the sharp burn of the metal digging into her skin, the way Mitchell's grip had tightened instinctively when he had realized his mistake, the way the entire room had stopped moving the moment Marcus had spoken. And then Marcus inhaled, deep, controlled, methodical. Take the cuffs off. The words weren't loud. They weren't yelled, weren't barked, weren't delivered with the fury that was undoubtedly simmering just beneath his skin, but they carried weight. They were an order, an unshakable, absolute command. Mitchell didn't move at first, not because he was refusing, but because his body hadn't caught up to the reality of the situation. Danielle felt it before she saw it. The way his fingers twitched, the way his jaw clenched, the way his breath hitched in his throat, as if he was struggling to force down the disbelief still clinging to him. "Sir," Mitchell started again, still grasping, still desperate for control. She was causing a disturbance." Marcus took a step forward. Just one. Just enough. Mitchell immediately stopped talking. The space between them was razor-thin now, but Marcus didn't need proximity to make himself known. He was already everywhere, in every breath of silence, in every glance cast between the officers in the room, in every second that passed where Mitchell's career slipped further through his fingers. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his voice now quieter than before, lethal in its restraint. "Take the cuffs off." Mitchell swallowed hard, his fingers flexing against the metal for half a second before he finally, reluctantly, reached for his key. The click of the cuffs unlocking echoed too loudly in the silent room. Danielle felt the release, felt the shift, but she didn't move. Not yet. Mitchell stepped back, his posture stiff, his breath uneven, his fingers lingering near his belt as if he was still trying to find his authority, somewhere in the weight of his uniform. Marcus exhaled slowly, a breath full of fire that never made it to the surface. He turned his head slightly, his gaze flicking toward his wife. "Are you okay?" Danielle finally moved, her hands flexing slightly. The lingering ghost of the metal still burned into her skin. She rolled her wrists, brushing them lightly before nodding once. "I'm fine." Mitchell scoffed, quiet, barely audible, but still there. Marcus's gaze snapped back to him so fast that Mitchell visibly flinched. "Something funny?" Marcus asked, his voice dangerously low, the kind of quiet that made every other officer in the precinct take another step back, as if instinctively knowing that something was about to break. Mitchell hesitated, his fingers tightening into a subtle but telling fist. He was crumbling now, unraveling, his confidence slipping between the cracks in his arrogance. "Sir," he tried again, his voice now edged with something defensive, something desperate, something resentful. "I was just doing my job." Marcus's brow lifted slightly, his expression darkening. "Your job?" Mitchell straightened his shoulders, trying to reclaim what little ground he had left. "Yes, sir." She was being uncooperative. She was disturbing the peace. She was sitting in a diner with her child. The words came out cold, razor-sharp, cutting through whatever excuse Mitchell had been about to offer. Mitchell stiffened. Marcus took another step forward, close enough now that there was no space left for misinterpretation. "Tell me," Marcus continued, his voice still calm but filled with something heavier now, something undeniable. "At what point did sitting at a table become a crime? At what point did eating breakfast with your daughter require police intervention? At what point did you decide that your badge gave you the right to target someone for nothing more than existing in a space you didn't think they belonged in?" Mitchell didn't answer, because there was no answer, because they both knew exactly what had happened. Marcus's jaw tensed just slightly, his breath steady, but his patience worn dangerously thin. He took another step, now so close that Mitchell had no choice but to meet his eyes. "Let me make something very clear to you, officer," Marcus said, his voice like steel, like thunder in the distance, like the moment before a landslide. "I don't care how things were done before I got here. I don't care what you thought you could get away with. I don't care how much you think that uniform protects you. What I care about is this." His voice dropped lower now, even sharper. "You are a disgrace to this badge. You are an embarrassment to this department. And, as of right now, you are under investigation for misconduct." Mitchell's entire body locked up. He inhaled sharply, his mouth opening as if to argue, as if to push back, as if to fight. But there was nothing left to fight for. The room had already chosen. The officers standing around the precinct, the ones who had been silent at first, were no longer just bystanders. Some looked relieved. Some looked cautious. Some looked at Mitchell with the kind of detachment that told him he was already lost. Because no one was going to stand beside him now. Because the balance of power had shifted. Because he wasn't the one in control anymore. Marcus took a slow step back, straightening, exhaling as if releasing the last bit of restraint he had left. Then, without breaking eye contact, he lifted a hand and motioned to two officers standing nearby. "Take his badge." Mitchell's breath caught. Marcus's voice was absolute. "And take him out of my sight." The station remained frozen in the aftermath of Marcus's words, the weight of his authority settling over the room like a slow-moving storm, heavy with unspoken consequences. Mitchell stood stiffly, his fingers still curled into tight fists, his chest rising and falling with shallow, clipped breaths. His face was twisted into something caught between disbelief and defiance, his mind clearly rejecting the reality unfolding in front of him. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. He was the officer. She was the problem. This wasn't discipline. This was politics. His jaw clenched as his gaze flickered around the room, his grip tightening on the last fraying threads of authority he thought he still held. Marcus's voice cut through the heavy silence again, measured and controlled but carrying an undeniable finality. "Take his badge." The order landed like a hammer, and the weight of it hit Mitchell square in the chest. One of the officers nearby, a man Mitchell had worked alongside for years, shifted uneasily before stepping forward. His expression was carefully neutral, his gaze firm but unreadable, as if even he wasn't quite sure whether to feel satisfaction or discomfort at what was happening. "Travis," the officer muttered, low and warning. Mitchell's eyes snapped to him, his nostrils flaring. "Are you serious?" His voice was sharp, incredulous, bordering on frantic. "You're really gonna do this?" The officer didn't answer. Because it wasn't a choice. The moment stretched, Mitchell's entire body thrumming with barely contained outrage. His fingers flexed at his sides, his muscles coiling tight with the kind of restrained anger that only existed in men who had never been told no. Marcus took another step forward, his voice colder now, sharper. "You have 10 seconds before I have someone escort you out of this building." Mitchell's breath came short and clipped, his entire frame trembling with a rage he couldn't direct at anyone without consequences. His fingers twitched over his uniform, hovering near his badge, hesitating, not out of reluctance but out of pure, undiluted resentment. Finally, with a sharp, jerking motion, he ripped it from his chest, his movements stiff and violent, his face twisting as if the mere act was an insult to his very being. For a second, he just held it, staring at it, like it was still his, like this was all a mistake that could be undone. Then, with as much force as his anger could manage, he shoved it into the officer's waiting palm. The moment it left his fingers, something cracked in him. But it wasn't regret. It wasn't even fear. It was rage. Mitchell's chest heaved, his fingers curling into his palms, his jaw locking so tight it looked as if his teeth might shatter under the pressure. He let out a sharp, huffed breath, his entire body coiled with the unbearable weight of a man who had never once believed that he would be the one in this position. "This is bullshit," he spat, voice cutting through the room, thick with venom and indignation. "I did my damn job." Marcus didn't move. Danielle, standing just a few feet away, finally rolled her wrists, the sharp ache from the cuffs fading now as she tilted her head slightly, studying the man unraveling before her. "Did your job," she repeated, slowly, deliberately, her voice coated in a layer of something cold and sharp. "So, tell me, Officer Mitchell, what exactly was your job supposed to be today? Was it the part where you insulted a mother in front of her child? Or the part where you escalated a situation because I refused to let you get away with it?" She let the words land, let the silence sit, let the moment stretch just long enough before delivering the final cut. "Or was your job just to remind everyone in that diner who you thought had power?" Mitchell's eyes flashed with something sharp, something ugly. "I don't need to justify myself to you," he sneered, his voice low, seething. "You don't know what it's like, dealing with people like you, day in and day out. The attitudes, the disrespect, the constant pushing, like we're the bad guys just for doing our damn jobs." Danielle exhaled sharply, letting out a small, humorless laugh. "You really don't get it, do you?" She took a slow step forward, not intimidated, not shaken, not afraid. "You think I was a problem because I didn't make it easy for you, because I didn't bow my head, because I made you explain yourself instead of letting you talk down to me like I was beneath you." Her voice didn't rise, but it sharpened, each word landing with the weight of something undeniable. Mitchell's jaw twitched. "And now, look at you," she continued, her gaze steady, her voice dripping with quiet finality. "Even now, standing here, stripped of your badge, being walked out of your own station, you still don't think you did anything wrong." Mitchell let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I didn't." His voice was hard, certain. "This isn't justice. This is a goddamn witch hunt." His eyes snapped back to Marcus, burning with resentment. "You can play the hero all you want, Chief, but you and I both know exactly what's happening here." He took a sharp step forward, his lip curling. "You're making an example out of me. That's it. This isn't about justice. It's about power. Yours, not mine." Marcus stared at him, his expression unreadable, his breath measured, his presence unmoving. Then, slowly, he exhaled, and he smiled. It wasn't a smirk. It wasn't triumphant. It wasn't mocking. It was worse. It was the kind of smile that came from a man who knew he had already won. "You finally understand," Marcus said, his voice quiet, deadly. "This is about power." He let the words settle, let them sink in, let Mitchell choke on them before delivering the final blow. "And you don't have any anymore." Mitchell's face darkened, his hands twitching at his sides, his body still resisting the reality of the moment. The two officers who had been standing nearby finally stepped forward, one placing a firm hand on Mitchell's arm. "It's time to go," the officer muttered. Mitchell jerked his arm out of reach, but he didn't fight. Not because he had accepted it, but because he still believed this wasn't over, because he still believed he was in the right, because he still thought, somehow, some way, he could win. Danielle watched him go, her eyes never leaving him, her stance steady, unyielding. He didn't look back, because he couldn't, and as the doors to the station swung shut behind him, she knew that whatever fight was still left in him, it didn't matter anymore, because this was the beginning of the real reckoning. The town did not stay quiet. The moment Officer Travis Mitchell was escorted out of the precinct, the ripples of what had happened spread outward like cracks in glass, splintering through the community in ways that no one could ignore. Within hours, the news broke. The chief of police had placed a decorated officer under investigation for misconduct. Some read the headlines and saw justice. Others saw betrayal. And Mitchell? He saw an opportunity. Because he wasn't going to fade quietly into irrelevance. He wasn't going to let himself be another name added to the growing list of officers sacrificed to appease an agenda he refused to believe in. He was going to fight. By morning, the story was on every news station. local papers plastering the headline across their websites, radio hosts dissecting every angle, and social media exploding with debates that carried more fire than fact. There were two camps. One side saw the truth, the footage, the diner patrons coming forward, the weight of a system that had long protected men like Mitchell, until they were finally forced to answer for their actions. But the other side? The other side refused to believe it was that simple. "This is political," a retired officer grumbled on a local morning show, his voice lined with the kind of bitterness that always came from those who couldn't see the cracks in the foundation they had spent decades defending. Chief Carter came in with an agenda. "This isn't about justice. This is about power." The same words Mitchell had hissed in the precinct. The same justification. The same delusion. By midday, protesters had started gathering. Some stood outside City Hall, holding signs demanding accountability, calling for a full investigation into how many officers had been getting away with the same kind of misconduct. Others stood outside the police department, not in support of justice, but in defense of Mitchell. Signs reading "Back the Blue" lined the sidewalk. Voices fueled not by facts, but by fury, refusing to accept that maybe, just maybe, the badge did not make a man untouchable. And in the midst of all of it, standing in front of a podium hastily set up outside his lawyer's office, Mitchell made his announcement. Camera shutters clicked. Microphones were shoved forward, reporters leaning in as Mitchell stepped up, the anger still simmering beneath his carefully constructed mask of defiance. "I never thought I'd see the day where doing your job meant losing everything," he said, his voice strong, unwavering, dripping with resentment. "But that's exactly what happened to me." His lawyer, a man whose reputation had been built on defending officers in cases just like this, stood beside him, nodding in solemn agreement. Mitchell inhaled sharply, glancing around the crowd before continuing. "I've dedicated my career to protecting this town," he said, the words carefully chosen, crafted to sound like something noble rather than something tainted. "I've upheld the law. I've put my life on the line. And what do I get in return? I get thrown under the bus to satisfy a political stunt." The crowd murmured, some nodding, some watching with cautious skepticism. And then he dropped the bomb. "That's why I'm suing the department," he announced, his voice clear, bold, full of conviction. "And I'm suing Chief Carter personally for defamation, wrongful termination, and abuse of power." The press erupted. Questions were hurled at him, voices overlapping, cameras flashing, the noise a chaotic blend of outrage, excitement, and anticipation. Marcus heard it before he saw it. He had been in his office, reviewing the reports, going over the details of the internal investigation, when the first notification hit his phone. Then another. And another. By the time he stepped out of his office, half the precinct was already gathered around the break room TV, watching the news as Mitchell's face filled the screen. Marcus didn't react, didn't speak, didn't show even a flicker of surprise, because he knew men like Mitchell. They never admitted they were wrong. They fought until their last breath, not because they had truth on their side, but because they couldn't stand the idea of losing. The lawsuit landed like a firebomb, igniting a battle that would not be fought with fists or badges, but in courtrooms and press conferences. Marcus sat across from his legal team later that afternoon, his posture composed, his expression unreadable. "He doesn't have a case," one of the lawyers muttered, flipping through the legal complaint. "But that doesn't matter. He's not trying to win in court. He's trying to win in public opinion." Marcus nodded once, his fingers steepled, his breath slow and steady. "He thinks if he makes this big enough," another lawyer added, "if he drags this out long enough, the department will cave just to avoid the headache. He thinks they'll settle." "They won't," Marcus said, his voice low, absolute. Danielle, sitting beside him, crossed her arms, her expression lined with quiet fury. "He still thinks he's the victim," she muttered, shaking her head. "Even after everything. even after the footage, the witnesses, the way the entire town saw him for what he really is. He still thinks he's in the right. Marcus exhaled slowly, his fingers pressing against the tabletop. Because, in his mind, he is, he murmured. The room fell silent. Danielle's lips parted slightly, her gaze sharp, her breath heavy with understanding, because she knew Marcus was right. Mitchell didn't see himself as a disgraced officer. He saw himself as the victim of a system that was supposed to protect him. A system that had always shielded him before. And now, he was doing what men like him always did when they finally faced the consequences of their own actions. He was doubling down. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his breath steady, his resolve unshaken. "We're not just fighting him," he said finally. "We're fighting everyone who thinks like him." Danielle exhaled, slow and controlled. Then she nodded. "Then let's make sure we win." The night had settled over the city, stretching long and heavy, wrapping the streets in a hush that felt at odds with the storm brewing beyond the walls of their home. The world outside was alive with noise, tension, debate, every news station dissecting the lawsuit, every social media platform overflowing with arguments, every radio talk show spinning the case into another battle in a never-ending war of narratives. But inside the Carter household, it was quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet. Danielle stood in the kitchen, her fingers resting lightly against the counter, her body still, her mind far from the warm glow of the light above her. It had been a long day, too long, the kind of day where everything felt stretched tight, where exhaustion sank deeper than just the body. It settled in the bones, in the spaces between thoughts, in the kind of silence that wasn't truly restful. She heard footsteps before she saw her, small and careful, the hesitant patter of bare feet against the floor. Mia. Danielle turned, already knowing the look she would find in her daughter's eyes, wide, searching, full of too many questions for a child so young. "Hey, baby," Danielle murmured, her voice softer than she expected, smoothing the exhaustion from her tone as she knelt down to meet her. "Couldn't sleep?" Mia shook her head, her small fingers twisting into the hem of her oversized sleep shirt. "Too much noise," she admitted quietly. Danielle's heart tightened. She knew Mia wasn't talking about the house. She was talking about the world outside. Mia hesitated, her little brows knitting together, the words forming before she was ready to say them. "And then, are they mad at Daddy?" Danielle inhaled, deep and steady, forcing herself to hold her daughter's gaze, not to look away, not to soften the truth so much that it became something else entirely. She reached out, brushing a gentle hand over Mia's hair before speaking. "Some people are," she admitted, her voice even. "Some people don't like that Daddy made sure the right thing happened." Mia's lips pressed together tightly, processing. "But he's the boss. Why are they mad at him for stopping the bad guy?" Danielle let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of that question settle deep into her chest. She wished she could tell Mia the world was as simple as that right and wrong were clear, that consequences always found the guilty, that people who did bad things were punished, and people who did good were always rewarded. But Mia was 8 years old, and already the world was trying to teach her something different. "It's not always easy to make people see what's right," Danielle said, choosing her words carefully, threading truth with reassurance. "Some people don't want to see it. Some people get mad when they have to answer for the things they've done. And sometimes, when someone like Daddy makes sure they do, they try to fight back." Mia frowned, shifting on her feet. "Like when you tell someone to say sorry, but they don't want to?" Danielle let out a small, quiet laugh, shaking her head. "Kind of like that," she said gently. "Except instead of saying sorry, they're trying to make it seem like they didn't do anything wrong at all." Mia's frown deepened, frustration flickering in her young features. "That's not fair." "No," Danielle agreed softly. "It's not." Mia stared down at the floor, processing, thinking, her small hands still gripping her shirt. Then, finally, she looked up again, her voice quieter now. "Is Daddy gonna be okay?" Danielle's chest ached at the way she asked it. So small, so uncertain, so full of the kind of worry a child shouldn't have to carry. She smoothed a hand over Mia's cheek, leaning in closer, letting her voice drop into something solid, something certain. "Daddy is the strongest person I know," she said, her words low but full of quiet, unwavering truth. "And he's not alone. We're in this together, all of us. And no matter what happens, we'll be okay." Mia watched her carefully, her small face searching for cracks, for doubt, for anything that might make her believe otherwise. But there was nothing. Danielle saw the tension ease, not completely, but enough. Mia gave a slow, thoughtful nod. And then, without a word, she stepped forward, wrapping her arms around Danielle's neck. Danielle's throat tightened, her arms curling around her daughter, holding her close, feeling the small weight of her, the warmth of her, the fragile strength of a child trying to understand a world that wasn't fair. They stayed like that for a moment. A long, quiet moment, standing in the kitchen, in a house filled with shadows and worry, but also love. Always love. Then, a familiar voice from the doorway. "You two having a meeting without me?" Danielle looked up just as Marcus stepped into the kitchen, his presence filling the space with something steady, something grounding. He was still in his uniform, his tie loosened, exhaustion sitting at the edges of his expression, but his eyes softened the second he took in the sight of them. Mia turned instantly, stepping away from Danielle and moving toward her father, wrapping her small arms around his waist before he could even reach her. Marcus exhaled, letting out a quiet breath as he leaned down, pressing a kiss against the top of her head. "You okay, baby girl?" he murmured. Mia nodded, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I just wanted to make sure you were." Marcus's jaw tightened, emotion flickering in his features before he smoothed it away. He held her a little tighter, just for a second, before finally pulling back and crouching to meet her eyes. "I'm good," he promised. "But you know who's even better?" Mia tilted her head. "Who?" He smiled, small but genuine. "You." Mia's face brightened just a little, her lips curling into something soft, something real. Danielle watched them, something warm unfolding in her chest, even in the midst of everything. Marcus straightened, his hand resting lightly on Mia's shoulder as he met Danielle's gaze over her head. A silent exchange, a question, a confirmation. She nodded, just slightly, just enough. Mia let out a small yawn, rubbing her eyes with the back of her hand, and Danielle took that as her cue. "Come on, baby," she murmured, pressing a hand to Mia's back. "Time for bed." Mia didn't argue, and as she followed her mother down the hall, she turned once more, her gaze finding her father. Marcus offered her a small wink. Mia smiled, just a little, before disappearing into her room. Danielle returned minutes later, finding Marcus still standing in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, his expression heavier now that Mia was gone. She stepped toward him, her arms crossing loosely. "It's getting ugly," she murmured. Marcus let out a slow breath. "It's gonna get worse." Danielle nodded, unsurprised. "Then we fight." Marcus turned his head, his gaze locking onto hers. And then, finally, he let the exhaustion show. She saw it. She stepped closer, resting a hand against his chest, feeling the slow, steady beat beneath her palm. He exhaled, leaning into her touch for just a second. Then, his voice, low, firm, absolute. "We fight." The morning after Mitchell's lawsuit hit the media, the storm truly began. It was one thing for people to argue about what had happened at the diner, for debates to stir in barbershops and coffee shops, for online comment sections to become battlegrounds where strangers hurled words like weapons. But the moment Mitchell stepped in front of the cameras, turned himself into the face of so-called injustice, and painted himself as the real victim in this fight, the conversation changed. Now, it wasn't just about a cop who had crossed the line. It was about power. It was about control. It was about the people who saw themselves in him and the ones who knew better. And now, Marcus and Danielle were standing at the center of it. The press conference had been carefully staged, a backdrop of supporters, a podium placed at the perfect angle to make Mitchell look like a fallen soldier, an American flag hanging just within frame. His lawyer stood beside him, a man whose name carried weight in conservative legal circles, someone who had built a career on defending officers accused of misconduct, turning them into symbols of a system under attack. Mitchell, dressed in a dark suit instead of a uniform, his tie just loose enough to look casual but still respectable, gripped the edges of the podium like he was standing in a war zone instead of a parking lot. "I dedicated my life to this town," he began, his voice measured, practiced. "I put on that badge every day knowing the risks, knowing the sacrifices, because that's what good officers do. And now, because of a political witch hunt, I've been thrown aside like I was never one of them." The cameras flashed. The crowd behind him, small but loud, nodded, muttering in agreement. "This wasn't about justice," he continued, his voice rising just enough to sound impassioned without losing control. "This was about power. Chief Carter wanted to make a statement, and he used me to do it. He took my career, my reputation, and my future, all to push an agenda." A few voices shouted in agreement from the crowd. Familiar phrases, the same words that always came out when accountability came knocking. "This is just the beginning," Mitchell promised. "We're going to fight back, and we're going to win." The press erupted with questions, microphones shoved forward, headlines already being written before the conference was even over. Marcus watched it unfold from his office. The TV was on, the live feed flickering across the screen, but he wasn't really watching Mitchell. He was watching the people behind him, the supporters, the ones nodding along, the ones clutching their signs, the ones who weren't really there for him, but for what he represented. "This isn't about him anymore," Marcus muttered, his jaw tight, his arms crossed over his chest as he stood in front of the screen. Danielle, seated at the desk, leaned back slightly, her fingers tapping against the polished wood. "It never was." Marcus exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders back, forcing the tension to settle. "He's going to drag this out," Danielle continued, studying the footage like she was dissecting a chessboard. "He knows he can't win in court, but that's not the point. He's playing for time. The longer this lasts, the better his chances of making people believe he's the victim." Marcus let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. "The longer this lasts, the more they'll talk about it like it's a debate instead of facts." Danielle nodded. "That's exactly what he wants." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Marcus turned away from the screen, rubbing a hand over his face, before settling against the edge of the desk. "This case should be open and shut," he muttered. "Body cam footage, witnesses, his history of complaints." He shook his head, his expression set with the frustration of a man who had seen the system bend in the wrong direction too many times before. If he wasn't a cop, he wouldn't have a leg to stand on. Danielle's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze steady. If he wasn't a cop, he wouldn't have made it this far. Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the truth in that. Danielle watched him carefully, the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers curled slightly against the desk. "You're ready for this, right?" she asked, her voice even, but carrying something underneath it. Marcus met her gaze. "I don't have a choice." "That's not what I asked." A beat. Marcus exhaled, slow and steady, before shaking his head slightly. "No," he admitted. "I'm not." Danielle tilted her head slightly, waiting. Marcus ran a hand over his jaw, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed the weight of what was ahead of them. "I knew this wasn't going to be easy," he said, his voice low, measured. "I knew coming in as chief meant pushing back against people who didn't want change. But this isn't just about him. This is about everyone like him. Everyone who thinks accountability is oppression. Everyone who sees justice as a personal attack." Danielle leaned forward slightly, her elbows resting against her knees, her voice quiet but solid. "You knew this was coming the second you told him to take off that badge?" Marcus let out a slow breath. "Yeah," he muttered. "I just didn't think it would be this fast." Danielle's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't surprise either. They always move fast when they feel threatened. Marcus let her words sit. Then, finally, He straightened, rolling his shoulders back, squaring himself like a man preparing for battle. "Well," he said, his voice steadier now, the weight settling into something firm, something certain. "Then we move faster." Danielle nodded, satisfied. The fight was only just beginning. The courtroom was silent, but heavy with tension, the kind of charged stillness that settled in a space where everyone knew the moment was bigger than itself, bigger than the people involved, bigger than the individual case. This was more than one man's fight to clear his name. This was a battle for control, for power, for the ability to bend the truth long enough for it to snap in the wrong direction. Mitchell sat at the defendant's table, stiff-backed, dressed in a suit that looked like it had been bought just for the occasion. The knot of his tie pulled a little too tight, the strain visible in his jaw, in the way his fingers drummed against the edge of the table, in the way he kept shifting, as though his own skin felt wrong. His lawyer sat beside him, flipping through notes with the ease of a man who had defended worse, who had seen cases twist and turn with the right argument, the right spin, the right jury. But Mitchell was not relaxed. He was angry, and Marcus could see it. From where he sat on the other side of the room, alongside his legal team, alongside Danielle, he saw the way Mitchell clenched his jaw, the way his leg bounced slightly beneath the table, the way his fingers curled into fists only to be flexed out again, as if he was trying to remind himself that he was still here, still fighting, still convinced he had been wronged. And maybe, for a moment, Mitchell had believed this would be his redemption. Maybe he had thought he would walk into this courtroom and turn himself into the victim, convince the jury that he had simply been doing his job, that he was the casualty of an overreaching administration, that he had been betrayed by the system he had sworn to serve. But Mitchell was not in control of the room, and he knew it. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who had been through too many cases like this to entertain theatrics, glanced up from her notes. "Mr. Mitchell, please take the stand." Mitchell stood, his movements sharp, controlled, as though every step toward the witness stand was an act of defiance. His lawyer had prepped him, had told him to remain calm, to keep his answers measured, to let his indignation show, but not spill over. But Marcus knew men like Mitchell, and he knew that self-control was not his strong suit. Mitchell took his oath, sat down, adjusted his tie. He was ready to perform. His lawyer stepped forward. "Officer Mitchell," he began, his voice smooth, practiced, the tone of a man who had rehearsed this part of the play 100 times before. "Tell us, in your own words, what happened on the day of your termination." Mitchell exhaled sharply, as if the mere thought of it filled him with bitterness. "I was doing my job," he said, his voice carrying through the courtroom, tight but controlled. "That morning, I went into the diner like I always do, and I saw an individual causing a disturbance. Marcus did not move, did not blink, did not react. Danielle, beside him, sat just as still. Mitchell paused, as if waiting for the jury to absorb his words, as if hoping someone would lean forward, waiting to hear how he had been so wronged. His lawyer nodded. "And this individual, a woman," Mitchell corrected, his voice dripping with something sour, something bitter, sitting there, making a scene. "I tried to de-escalate, but she got aggressive." The words hung there, sharp, deliberate. Marcus's fingers curled against his knee, but his expression remained impassive. Mitchell was lying, but not in the way that would break him. He was crafting a version of the truth that allowed him to look like the victim. His lawyer nodded, as if this was exactly what he had expected. "And when you say aggressive, what exactly do you mean?" Mitchell turned slightly, as if addressing not just the lawyer, but the jury, the audience, the people who would shape the end of this fight. "I mean, she was disrespectful," he said. "She wouldn't listen to a direct order from an officer of the law. She was combative. She was belligerent. She escalated the situation, and I had no choice but to arrest her." There it was, his version of events, his justification, his attempt to rewrite the story just enough to shift the blame. Danielle didn't move, but Marcus felt the way her body tensed beside him. Mitchell's lawyer stepped back, nodding as if his client had just revealed some great truth. No further questions. The judge turned her gaze. Prosecution, Marcus exhaled slowly, as their lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ellen Vasquez, rose to her feet. She had been waiting for this. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, flipping through her notes before fixing her gaze on Mitchell. "Officer Mitchell," she began, her tone polite, but with an underlying sharpness that could not be ignored. "I want to go back to something you just said. You stated that Ms. Carter was combative." Mitchell nodded stiffly. "Did she physically threaten you?" Mitchell hesitated. A second too long. "No," he admitted. "But she was escalating." "Escalating how?" Mitchell squared his shoulders, settling into his justification. "She was talking back, raising her voice." Ellen tilted her head slightly. "Is raising one's voice illegal, officer?" Mitchell hesitated again. "It's disorderly conduct." Ellen nodded. "Disorderly conduct. Right. Now, you've been an officer for several years, correct?" 15, Mitchell answered, as if his tenure was a badge in itself. "In those 15 years, how many times have you arrested someone for disorderly conduct based solely on raising their voice?" Mitchell's jaw tightened. The room was still. Ellen let the question linger. Then, before Mitchell could answer, she flipped a page in her file, her voice turning even sharper. "Or is it only disorderly when a black woman doesn't back down?" Marcus heard the collective inhale from the audience. Mitchell's face twisted. "That's not what happened," he said. His voice clipped, controlled, but laced with frustration. Ellen smiled. "Then let's talk about what did." She turned, pressing a button on the remote in her hand. The screen in the courtroom lit up, and the body cam footage began to play. Mitchell's face drained of color. Because there it was. His words, his tone, his smirk. The insults, the dismissal, the power play. And then, the moment he said it. No father around, no real discipline. No wonder the kid's already a problem. The courtroom was silent. Mitchell's fingers twitched. Ellen turned back to him, her expression unreadable, but her victory already clear. No further questions. The air in the courtroom was thick with expectation, every breath slow and measured, every movement deliberate, every word carrying more weight than it should. Mitchell sat rigid, his face drawn tight, his fingers curled into fists on the table, his jaw clenched so hard it looked like he was barely holding himself together. He had spent weeks painting himself as the victim, convincing himself that the world had turned against him, that this wasn't justice, but a personal vendetta. But now, the weight of his own words sat heavy in the room, his voice recorded, his intentions laid bare, his justifications crumbling beneath the evidence. And yet, he still thought he could win. Danielle sat across the room, calm, composed, steady in a way that defied the chaos Mitchell had tried to bring down on her. She had been waiting for this moment. Not for vengeance, not for satisfaction, but for truth. The judge called her name. She stood, smoothing her hands down the front of her blazer before making her way to the witness stand. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor, the only sound in the otherwise silent room, each step deliberate, unhurried, unshaken. She raised her right hand, took the oath, lowered herself into the seat. Ellen Vasquez, their lead attorney, stepped forward, her presence unwavering, her tone measured but firm. "Ms. Carter," Ellen began, flipping open her notes, though it was clear she hardly needed them. "I'd like to take you back to the morning of your arrest. Can you tell us, in your own words, what happened?" Danielle exhaled slowly, meeting Ellen's gaze, then turning slightly to face the jury. "My daughter and I were having breakfast," she said, her voice smooth, unhurried, controlled. "It was our usual routine. She had just been telling me how proud she was of her father's promotion. That morning, all I was thinking about was how to explain to her what leadership meant, what responsibility meant, how important it was to do the right thing, even when it was hard." She paused, letting the moment sit. letting the weight of those words sink in. And then Officer Mitchell walked in. Her tone did not change. She did not look at him. She did not acknowledge his presence at all. Ellen nodded. And what happened next? Danielle folded her hands lightly in her lap, her posture still, but her words carrying the undeniable gravity of someone who had lived this moment 1,000 times in her memory. He looked at me like he had already decided something about me, she said, her voice still calm, but lined with something deeper, something that wasn't anger, but resolve. He didn't say anything at first. He didn't have to. That kind of judgment, when you've seen it enough times, you recognize it before a word is even spoken. She took a breath. My daughter accidentally bumped into him, she continued, her voice steady. It was an accident. She's 8. And instead of brushing it off, instead of speaking to her like any decent person would speak to a child, he made a comment. Ellen tilted her head slightly. What did he say? Danielle's jaw tightened, but she did not hesitate. He said, "Guess I should have known better than to walk past a table like this." The words hung in the room like a slow-burning match, the unspoken meaning so clear it didn't need to be explained. Ellen took a slow step forward. "And how did that make you feel?" Danielle met her gaze. "Like I wasn't a person to him," she said simply. Ellen let that sit for a moment before continuing. "What happened after that?" Danielle inhaled again, slow, steady, but her fingers curled just slightly against the wood of the stand. "I told him that my daughter was a child, that it was an accident, that there was no reason to speak to her that way." Her voice didn't rise, but there was something stronger in it now, something that resonated deep beneath the surface. And that's when he started pushing, making comments, letting me know exactly what he thought of me, of my daughter, of who he assumed we were before he even knew our names. Mitchell shifted in his seat, his shoulders rising slightly, his discomfort clear, his face tight. Danielle did not look at him. Ellen nodded. "And when you didn't back down?" Danielle's gaze didn't waver. "He escalated." Silence. Ellen took a slow step closer. "He arrested you?" Danielle nodded once. "Yes." "Had you committed a crime?" "No." "Were you threatening him?" "No." "Were you violent?" "No." Ellen turned to the jury, letting those answers sink into their bones. Then she turned back. "Ms. Carter," she said, voice softer now, but no less commanding, "I need you to answer this as honestly as you can. Why do you think Officer Mitchell arrested you that day?" Danielle knew the answer before the question was even finished. She turned her head, locking eyes with the jury, her voice clear, unshaken. "Because I didn't let him dehumanize me," she said, each word landing like a strike of thunder. Marcus felt the breath leave his chest. Because that was it. That was the truth at the center of all of this. Mitchell hadn't arrested her because she was a threat. He hadn't arrested her because she was disorderly. He had arrested her because she refused to let him strip her of her dignity. Ellen let the silence stretch, her gaze flickering over the jury, watching as the reality of those words settled into the spaces between them. Then, finally, she turned back to Danielle. "No further questions." The judge nodded, shifting her gaze toward the defense. "Cross-examination?" Mitchell's lawyer stood, adjusting his tie, his attempt at regaining control painfully transparent. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice smooth, but laced with the kind of forced patience that came from someone who knew they were losing. "Would you say you were angry that morning?" Danielle tilted her head slightly. "Wouldn't you be?" A few quiet chuckles from the gallery, quickly silenced. Mitchell's lawyer forced a thin smile. "But your voice was raised." Danielle shrugged slightly. "I was standing up for my daughter." "So you admit you escalated the situation?" "No," she said simply. "I just didn't let him get away with what he wanted." The lawyer hesitated. He had nothing, and he knew it. Marcus watched as he cleared his throat, flipping through his notes, searching for anything that might save him. But there was nothing left to say. Danielle had spoken the truth, and it was now etched into the walls of that courtroom. Undeniable. Immovable. "No further questions," the lawyer muttered, defeated. Danielle stood, walked back to her seat, and never once looked in Mitchell's direction, because he was already nothing to her. The jury had been deliberating for 3 hours. The courtroom held its breath. the weight of expectation pressing down on every person seated within it, stretching time, making every second feel heavier than the last. Conversations had died into murmurs, then faded into absolute silence, as if the air itself had grown too thick to carry words. Marcus sat perfectly still, his face unreadable. But Danielle could feel the tension beneath his calm exterior, the way his fingers rested against his knee but didn't move, the way his breathing remained slow and measured, as if keeping himself anchored. She knew that patience had never been his strong suit. Not when it came to injustice, not when it came to waiting for the system to do what it so often failed to do. Danielle exhaled slowly, smoothing her hands against her lap, her mind quiet, but her body still carrying the memory of the cuffs, of the diner, of the moment Mitchell thought he could make her powerless. But she wasn't powerless, and neither was Marcus. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. The bailiff stepped forward. The jury had reached a decision. A ripple of movement stirred through the courtroom, people shifting in their seats, the atmosphere tightening as the jury filed in, their expressions carefully neutral, their eyes focused ahead. Mitchell, seated across the room, straightened slightly. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering something, but Mitchell barely reacted. He had spent the last 3 hours convincing himself that this was still going to go his way, that justice wasn't real, that power was still on his side, that this was just a minor setback before he walked out of this room and started planning his next move. But he was wrong. Danielle could feel it, the shift, the inevitability, the weight of a system that, for once, had been forced to look directly at the truth. The judge, seated high above them all, nodded toward the jury foreperson. Has the jury reached a verdict? A woman in the front row stood, a piece of paper in her hands. Her grip was steady, her expression unreadable, her voice clear and unshaken. We have, Your Honor. The paper was passed forward. The judge took it, unfolding it with careful precision, her gaze flickering across the words. Danielle watched her closely, reading the slight movement in her face, the way her lips pressed together, the way her eyes scanned each line. Then the judge lifted her head, her voice ringing through the courtroom with absolute finality. In the matter of Travis Mitchell versus the City of Brookhaven and Chief Marcus Carter regarding wrongful termination, defamation, and abuse of power, the jury finds in favor of the defense. A beat of silence, then a wave of sound, relief, murmurs, movement, tension breaking into something else entirely. Danielle let out a slow, measured breath. Not triumph, not celebration, just release. Marcus closed his eyes for half a second, just long enough for the weight of it all to settle, for the reality of what had just happened to take hold. Mitchell sat stiff and unmoving, his hands gripping the edge of the table, his face twisted into something unreadable. The judge continued. Furthermore, regarding Officer Mitchell's countersuit for reputational damage, the court finds no basis for financial compensation. The plaintiff's request is denied in full. Mitchell barely moved, but the fight drained from his body. The moment stretched, heavy, absolute, his loss sinking in, settling deep, suffocating him in a way he had never expected. For the first time, his lawyer looked like he had finally realized the battle was lost. And Mitchell? Mitchell still wasn't ready to accept it. His fingers twitched against the table, his jaw locking so tightly that a muscle in his cheek visibly strained. This is bullshit, he muttered under his breath. Danielle heard it. Marcus heard it. The entire courtroom felt it, but the judge's voice cut through it like a blade. Mr. Mitchell, she said, her tone sharp, commanding. You will respect this court and its ruling. I will not warn you again. Mitchell's eyes snapped up, his face tight with anger. But he didn't speak, because he had nothing left to say. The judge turned her gaze toward the defense table. Chief Carter, she said, her voice slightly softer but still firm. You and your department were justified in the actions taken against Mr. Mitchell. This court finds no wrongdoing in your decision to terminate his employment, nor in your handling of the incident that led to it. As of this ruling, All legal claims made by Mr. Mitchell against you and the city are officially dismissed." Marcus inclined his head slightly, his posture still composed, still measured. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said. The gavel struck the wood. "Court is adjourned." The tension broke. For a moment, everything moved at once. Reporters stirred, already preparing their headlines. Lawyers shook hands, files were closed. People stood, whispering, muttering, processing the weight of what had just happened. Danielle let out a slow breath, rolling her shoulders, allowing herself to feel the relief. Not in celebration, not in victory, but in knowing that justice, at least today, had won. Marcus turned toward her, and for the first time since this all began, a small, tired smile ghosted across his lips. Danielle met his gaze, reaching out, her fingers brushing against his. Marcus exhaled, clasping her hand, just for a moment. Just enough. Mitchell stood slowly, his movements stiff, reluctant, as though his body was resisting the loss even more than his mind was. His lawyer muttered something to him, but he didn't seem to hear it, because this wasn't over for him, not in his mind. Even as he turned toward the exit, even as the world around him accepted the truth of his downfall, Mitchell still believed he was the one who had been wronged. Danielle watched him go, her expression unreadable, her gaze steady. Then, finally, she turned back to Marcus. "It's done," she murmured. Marcus let out a slow breath, his eyes flickering toward the exit, where Mitchell had just disappeared through the doors. "No," he said, his voice quiet, thoughtful. "But it's over." Danielle nodded once, knowing exactly what he meant, because justice didn't erase what had happened. It didn't undo the mourning in the diner. It didn't take back the fear in Mia's eyes. It didn't fix the years of power being abused. The people who had suffered before this case, the ones who never had their day in court. But it was a step, a firm, unshakable step, and they would take it, together. The house was quiet when they returned home, but not the same kind of quiet they had been living in these past few weeks. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind, the one that filled the spaces between worry and waiting, the one that settled over their home like a storm cloud that never quite passed. This was different. This was relief. Marcus unlocked the front door, stepping inside first, letting out a slow, measured breath as he loosened his tie, rolling his shoulders as if he could finally let the weight of everything slip off of him, piece by piece. Danielle followed behind him, closing the door gently, her body still carrying the tension of the day, but in a different way now. Not in fear, not in anticipation, just in knowing that something had ended. They stood there for a moment, neither speaking, just letting themselves exist in the stillness of home, feeling the shift, the absence of the fight that had been pressing down on them for weeks. Then, a voice, small, cautious, hesitant. "Is it over?" Mia stood at the edge of the hallway, still in her pajamas, clutching the stuffed bear she had been holding on to more often lately, her expression uncertain, her wide, searching eyes flickering between them. Danielle's heart tightened. She glanced at Marcus, and he met her gaze, a silent exchange passing between them, something unspoken, but understood. They had won, but their daughter had lived through it too. Danielle crouched down, opening her arms without hesitation. "Come here, baby." Mia hesitated for only a second before running forward, throwing herself into her mother's arms, holding on to her with a grip that felt tighter than usual. Danielle wrapped her arms around her, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, breathing her in, the warmth of her, the smallness of her, the innocence that had been tested, but not broken. Marcus crouched beside them, running a hand gently down Mia's back, his voice softer than it had been in weeks. "It's over," he said. And for the first time, the words carried truth. Mia pulled back slightly, blinking up at him. "Really?" Danielle nodded, brushing a few curls from her daughter's face. "Really?" Mia let out a small breath, something between a sigh and relief, then frowned slightly, her little hands still gripping onto the fabric of her mother's sleeve. "What happens now?" Danielle glanced at Marcus again, then back to Mia. "Now," she said, smoothing a hand down her daughter's back, We go back to normal." Mia tilted her head. Like before? Danielle hesitated. Then she shook her head. "No," she admitted softly. "Not like before." Mia thought about that, her small brows furrowing, but there was no sadness in her expression, just curiosity. Then, finally, she nodded. "Okay." Marcus let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly before reaching out and pulling Mia into his arms, holding her close as he stood up. She let him, resting her head against his shoulder, small and safe in his hold, wrapped in the warmth of a father who had carried too much, but never let her see the weight of it. Danielle watched them for a moment, something settling inside her. They were okay, not untouched, not unchanged, but okay. Marcus turned, his free hand reaching for Danielle's, pulling her into him, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Something unspoken passing between them. Danielle closed her eyes, letting herself feel it. The warmth, the end of something, the beginning of something else. And then, just like that, the weight was gone. For the first time in weeks, they were simply a family. No courtrooms, no battles, no noise, just them. The case didn't disappear from the news overnight. There were still conversations, still debates, still people who refused to accept the verdict, who refused to acknowledge what had been laid out in front of them. But it didn't matter. The department felt it. The officers who had watched everything unfold, the ones who had been silent, the ones who had been uncertain, the ones who had seen what had happened and finally understood that power could no longer be wielded without consequence. Things changed. They didn't change all at once, but they did change. Complaints that had once been ignored were now investigated. Officers who had once been untouchable found themselves under scrutiny. The badge no longer protected those who thought it gave them a right to be above the people they served. And Mitchell? Mitchell was gone. Disgraced. A footnote in a case that would be remembered long after his name was forgotten. Justice had done what it was supposed to do. And that was enough. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.